Hello, everybody. It is Monday, February the 3rd, 2025. The news today, of course, is dominated by Donald Trump's focus on tariffs, according to the Financial Times. Trump is facing a backlash from businesses as tariffs ignite inflation fears, lots of hopes. And I wonder how it's impacting the auto industry. One piece by my guest today, Mike Colias from the Wall Street Journal. He's the auto editor of the journal. Suggests that tariff threat is prompting automakers to find new suppliers and consider higher prices, which is neither good, I guess, for the industry or for drivers, consumers. Meanwhile, American car makers continue to make quarterly losses, and they're making plans, including General Motors, for these potential tariffs. As I said, my guest today is Mike Colias. He has a very interesting new book out, Inevitable: Inside the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. And Mike is joining us from Ann Arbor in Michigan. Mike, congratulations on the new book. It's out this week. Before we get to what you call inevitable, what do you make of the tariff brouhaha? Is it boxing or wrestling? It always seems as if Donald Trump is more of a wrestler than a boxer. Do you think he's serious in all this?
Well, that was the big question in the industry leading up to just this past week. Every executive I talked to was like, this is just negotiations. Kind of felt like there was some bluffing going on, especially the Mexico and Canada. I mean, the auto industry has spent the last 3 decades, positioning their factory network and their supply chains to be able to have free trade with those countries. NAFTA, and now it's called USMCA, but that's allowed free trade of auto parts, of vehicles, and they kind of feel like the rug's been pulled out from under them. And it actually took effect on Saturday, and it's got a lot of these companies scrambling.
So you talk to a lot of senior people in the auto industry. Are there a lot of angry executives in Detroit, the guys you're talking to?
I think it's more consternation. I mean, there's a lot of things that the administration, I think, has talked about doing that probably would sit pretty well with some of the auto executives, deregulation, tax cuts. I think one thing he's talked about doing on the environmental side is rolling back some of the regulations that the Biden administration put in place in terms of, how much tailpipe pollution and carbon these cars could emit. And that's, the car companies felt like that was a real stretch to get there. It would have required about 50% of all cars to be electric by early next decade. No one really thinks that's feasible. So he is putting on the table some stuff that the industry would like to see. These tariffs are not one of them. Hugely disruptive, and a lot of people think it's going to lead to big inflation and an increase in the price of cars.
Yeah, it seems to unite everyone on the left and the right. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, which is a fairly conservative newspaper, are unambiguously negative on these tariff things. What about the unions? Unions are still relatively powerful in the car industry. Have you talked to many union leaders about tariffs, Mike?
They seem to be okay with it. The union UAW, its leader Sean Fain, has really emerged as a prominent figure in the last few years. He's been at odds big time with President Trump. Very much campaigned against him in the election. But when it comes to tariffs, I think the union feels like this is going to be the thing that forces the companies to create more jobs in the U.S., build more supply chains here that could lead to, higher employment. And so that's why I think the union sees this as a tool for, boosting up the American worker and creating jobs.
It's going to be interesting. It will play out over the next, certainly, few months. As I said, you've got a new book out this week, Inevitable: Inside the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. Is that word, Mike, inevitable, which people often use to describe new technologies like electric vehicles and AI, is that meant literally or with a degree of caution or even irony?
Well, I suppose we need to define what I'm talking about when I say inevitable. And I think by that, I mean, the electric vehicle story, the portion of car sales around the world that are electric versus internal combustion is going to continue to grow in the next few decades. And internal combustion gas and diesel engine cars will be on the decline. It's everyone's favorite game to guess like what the percentages might be. A lot of people thought in the US we'd get to half of the market being electric in a decade by 2035. That's probably when it's not looking likely at this point. But I think you need to remember about it is, we talk about the EV transition, and there's actually multiple transitions playing out sort of around the globe. And so here we're seeing a narrow view of things where about 10% of new car sales are either electric or plug-in hybrid. In China, it's 50%. And in Europe, it's somewhere in between, like 20 to 25%. And so, that's what makes this whole transition messy for the car business is if you're the CEO of Ford or General Motors, you've seen things cool off a little bit in the US. EV sales are still rising, but they're not rising as fast as the companies expected when they made these huge investments in factories and battery production a few years ago. There's a lot of interest, but it's not catching on like these companies thought in the
right,
US.
And you've written some pieces for the Journal last year about how American buyers at least want hybrids. What's the attraction? I always thought hybrids are drivers attempt to be, so to speak, half pregnant. Either you go the whole way with gas or you go with EVs. Why do people want hybrids, particularly in the US?
Yeah, I think hybrids are really proving to be a pretty important sort of bridge technology in this whole transition. A lot of companies, some companies, not all, but some companies felt like, okay, let's skip over that part of it. If we really believe the future's all electric, let's just start making electrics. We're going to keep the gas engine stuff around for a long time, but people are going to want these electrics. And I think they lost the consumer a bit in the plot. It's a big change in the way in your sort of relationship with your car. Plugging your car in every night doesn't come natural, and it's something. Once we've gotten through this sort of early wave of interest by early adopters, people who just love technology or for environmental reasons want an EV, we're starting to get to more pragmatic consumers who are into, there's a lot of interest, but you're asking people to pay a little bit more because they're a little pricier for a technology that they're not, they're a little apprehensive about. They don't know how it's going to fit into their life.
So I always understood hybrids to be like the Prius when that was successful, but literally a hybrid is something that can either work with gas or electric. Is that right?
So yeah, so there's two different hybrid systems. The Prius that a lot of people think about, which is in the early 2000s came on and was sort of the first one. It's just got a small battery and motor that helps the gas engine. It doesn't drive itself on electric power, but it assists the gas engine to the point where you're getting a lot better gas mileage. We've seen that technology spread to, tons of models now. I mean, it's not, you can walk into a showroom and, it's just another option sitting there. There's many, many models that have that hybrid, and you don't have to think about it. It's not, you don't plug it in. Then there's a second breed of hybrid, right? That's called a plug-in hybrid, where you do plug it in, you get a certain amount of fully electric driving range, let's say 30 to 40 miles before it switches over to gas. And the reason that's appealing to some people is you can get around town without using any gas. If you come back, charge overnight, you can do it again the next day. There's some people who have those hybrid cars who really don't visit the gas station much. And those are a smaller part of the market, but they're starting to catch on too. And it's just, I think you're seeing this as, there was so much interest in EVs in the last 5 years, but a lot of people, when they looked real hard at it, said, I'm not quite ready to take the leap. And so hybrids have really emerged. They're not a new technology, but they've emerged as something that I think people want to, try before they might take the leap to a fully electric car.
Maybe they're not quite as inevitable as you suggest. And for people just listening, I think one reason, Mike, you called your book Inevitable is because you have a beautiful cover with the EV in Inevitable lit up. So that's hard to resist. You noted a really astonishing difference between the Chinese and the American markets. You said 50% of what new cars sold in China are EVs, whereas only 15% in America. Lots of interpretations of that. My thoughts are twofold. Firstly, the distances in the US are enormous. And secondly, US car buyers tend to be more conservative and perhaps even reactionary. How would you explain this dramatic divergence in the Chinese and the US market when it comes to EVs?
Yeah, it's something that China, it's really interesting to look at the China story and in their arc is in terms of just their automotive industry generally and how they got to be such a juggernaut in EVs. I mean, it's a very young auto industry. They didn't really start making cars till the 90s. They brought in companies like GM and Volkswagen, which were partnered, by law, they had to partner with Chinese companies. And the Chinese automakers could never compete with internal combustion engines. They were always like the little sibling, didn't have the market share. The big guys dominated. And sometime in the early 2000s, the government decided, the only way we're going to get ahead in this industry is we're going to leap to electric over time, and we don't think that the traditional automakers are going to get there. And so they put their thumb on the scale in a big way, right? They incentivized, big incentives for people to buy electric cars, big incentives for companies to make them. A lot of, the battery supply chains are all, very much fixed in China. You've got other supply chains that help, labor is cheaper, all these reasons. And really we've seen just in the last 5 years, like the fruits of that, where that market has gone from less than 5% EVs sales now to approaching 50%. And so the reason why I think that's important for the US market, the US is going to take its time. You can't force consumers to buy stuff they don't want to buy. And we've seen that. That's why the companies are struggling to sell as many as they thought they would. But every auto executive I talk to knows that eventually they're going to have to compete against the Chinese on EVs because they believe that that's where the market's going. Investors certainly believe that's where the market going. There's a reason why Tesla's stock valuation is 10 times more than GM and Ford combined, right? It's bigger than the 10 biggest automakers in the world.
Which is an astonishing statistic.
It really is. And they make fewer cars than GM, Toyota, Volkswagen, right? But investors have decided that this is where it's going. That's where the growth is. And so, it's hard. If you're GM or Ford, you're losing a lot of money on your EVs right now, and you're making money on the stuff you've always been profitable on, which is big pickup trucks and SUVs. But they're not leaving to chance. They don't feel good about tariffs protecting them from these really
tariffs is the King Canute of all this, trying to stop the waves. Has this story, Mike, been told loudly enough in the US of the success of the Chinese EV market and its industry? Lots of anti-Chinese sentiment in US media. I've had too many shows with people coming on warning about Chinese this and that. You've written about it, but do you think most Americans and perhaps most people outside China quite understand the remarkable success of the Chinese EV industry?
I think it's starting to seep in a bit. I mean, when I started in on this book project a couple of years ago, that was one of the more surprising things. I've been to Shanghai a few times and seen the market there, but it was pre-pandemic, right? And so I was really surprised at sort of the arc of how they've gotten to where they have and how quickly they've emerged as this EV powerhouse. And I don't think, I'm not hearing people clamoring for, let's let Chinese cars into the US. I mean, I think President Trump at times has said, as long as a company's willing to build factories and employ workers here, we're going to be more open to that. Like, we'll see. I mean, there's national security concerns around that. The US has banned Chinese cars for that reason too. They don't want the software coming in. And
right. I was just in the market a couple of months ago for a new EV. And one of the cars I was looking at was the Mini, which of course is now owned by BMW, but the latest Mini EV is made in China. So it's not available in the US. I think you can buy it in Europe and obviously in China. So it's a complicated situation, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a long-term threat to the companies that are playing in the US market, because there's a few EVs that get shipped over from China, made by like Volvo, Polestar, but it's a few thousand. It's not in Europe. This is more of a present danger for the European car companies.
And I want to get to Europe in a second.
Yeah.
How good are these Chinese electric cars? I found some articles online suggesting that there are Chinese electric cars that they'd love to see in the US. Is this rather like the Japanese car industry or even the Korean, where at first no one took the cars seriously and then everybody wanted them?
I think it's kind of following this similar. I think the Korea analogy is a pretty good one. Kia and Hyundai 20 years ago, those were seen as like cheap and cheerful rental cars, and now they're making some of the best mainstream cars on the road in terms of the ratings they get, and just the brand identities that they've been able to forge. I think in China, sure, you still have a lot of cheap stuff over there, but what you've seen is a lot of especially on the electric side, you've seen these startups come in, and this company like NIO, for example, NIO, that was founded less than a decade ago. They went out and hired BMW's head of design, to be the one who sketches the cars, and all of a sudden they're turning out these beautiful vehicles. Now they've struggled and they've had to get bailed out by the Chinese government, and it's taken them a while, but now they've got these retail centers all over big cities in Europe, where it's like a high-end spa. They've really nailed the branding. There's several players like that are making cars that if you step in,
the companies that come to mind are BYD. I think it's the best known one. NIO, as you said, XPeng, Li Auto,
yep.
Leap, Zeekr. How in China? You said you spent some time in Shanghai recently. How much has the rest of the infrastructure changed, particularly when it comes to charging? Is it quite easy to run an electric vehicle in China? Or is there a lot of availability for home charging and charging on the road? In the US, of course, Tesla has a strong infrastructure, but the other companies are less impressive. I've owned a Tesla, so I know how good they are. I just got a BMW where the infrastructure is growing, but much less impressive than Tesla.
That's right. Yeah. The last time I was in Shanghai was actually 2018. So it was before the pandemic, and a lot has changed. One of the things that was striking to me in researching the book was, I think, the number of fast chargers, and really, I think fast chargers along highways is really what you need. We can talk about charging, but I think that's a key ingredient to EV adoption. And China has something like 20 to 25 times more fast chargers than the US does. I mean, it goes back to that whole China plan that the government had to sort of, plant the seeds and dominate this industry. They've just thrown a ton of money at it. And so that highway charging is big because that's what really drives adoption. So if you look at the China market, the two things that really hold people back from buying EVs, higher prices and worrying about charging, they've kind of solved both those. And that's why you're seeing close to half of the market now become EV.
I'm assuming also in China, most people live in high rises or certainly in urban settings where they don't live in houses. So presumably those sort of collective charging stations are much more important, whereas Americans, and it's easy to generalize here, tend to have their own houses. You mentioned Europe earlier. Is Europe, as always in these situations, somehow caught between China and the US? The German car makers, of course, the German car industry is critical to its economy, which is in crisis. Have German car makers, even if they're reporting a sales drop, your newspaper reported last year, I just got a BMW EV, which is really impressive, much more impressive in my view than a Tesla. Have they responded more impressively, certainly than the American car industry?
Yeah, it's approaching a quarter of the market. I think they've been forced to go harder into EVs earlier because the EU's regulations on carbon emissions have tightened considerably, and this year they kick in even harder. And so some of this is just regulatory driven. But what you have seen is the companies are now trying harder, right? They're putting out really nice vehicles, whereas 10 years ago they were just putting out whatever they needed to check a regulatory box. The stuff they're putting out now is it's eye catching. They're fun to drive. These are quick and quiet. And, you ask any EV owner and most of them will say they're not going to go back. So I think the Europeans have been forced in a couple different ways, not only regulatory, but they're getting hurt harder by the Chinese in the China market. That's been a huge source of profits, more so for the European brands in general than maybe the US brands. And every big car company has seen massive market share losses in China with what's gone on in this shift to EVs in the last 5 years. And so that's really hurt the bottom lines of the German automakers at a time when Europe's economy is now struggling too. So it's kind of a double whammy. And now you've got tariffs in the US that also affects companies like BMW, who make a lot of things in Mexico. So they're really under pressure, the European automakers.
So you're making me feel good about getting my car last month. What about a kind of reverse colonialism here, where now I know that VW is, one piece of news is it's handing its factories to Chinese electric car makers, presumably within China. Are you seeing strong alliances between China and Chinese and European manufacturers?
We've started to see some of that. Volkswagen, Nissan, I believe, have Stellantis, which makes Jeep and Ram. They've partnered with Chinese EV makers, so it's almost a bit of a reversal than what went on in the 90s and 2000s, where you had the big global automakers going in and sort of teaching the Chinese about car technology. Now it's almost flipped, where the Chinese have the advantage on battery technology and how to screw these cars together efficiently, because that's a big part of the batteries are so costly that the companies are under a ton of pressure to try to figure out how to do this as a cost efficiently as possible. That's why many of the companies are still losing money, is there's just, the batteries are so expensive. Chinese seem to have it figured out. A lot of that has to do with what's gone on in the supply chain there and government subsidies. And there's a bunch of different factors, and they've certainly, tilted the market in that direction. But I think the Western automakers are now seeking, advice and help from the Chinese automakers.
Yeah, we've done some shows on Chinese quote unquote colonialism in Africa and its mining of essential components for batteries. How important is all this policy, do you think, in more official Chinese policy, especially in terms of relationships with countries in Africa, in particular, with valuable primary materials for the manufacture of batteries?
Yeah, I think cobalt is one where.
Yeah, we did a book. I don't know if you've read it. It's an excellent book, Cobalt Red, which.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's amazing what China has been able to do. I mean, they mine a lot of the key minerals. The usual suspects tend to be lithium, nickel, magnesium, cobalt, graphite. China has a lot of that. They mine a lot of it on their own. The stuff that they don't, they've been able to go and buy companies in Africa, in the Congo. You can go to towns there, and it's like all Chinese restaurants, for example, because the Chinese have bought up so much of those assets. And now China basically processes the processing of these minerals. Almost all of it happens in China. I mean, the majority of all of those key minerals get processed in China. And so this is why there's such a big push to, it's the same with computer chips, right? And some of this AI stuff. We want to build this stuff here now. I mean, the executives of these companies do not want to be reliant on the Chinese supply chains for the stuff that's going to dictate their future. And so that's why we're seeing this mad scramble. But it's years and years and years in the making to try to rework these supply chains to make more of it in North America or Europe.
Yeah, it's hard to see the Americans or even the Europeans catching up. It's rather like Trump coming to a fight with rocks in his pocket and facing the Chinese, who have machine guns or even nuclear weapons. I mean, it seems to me that the tariff issue simply misses the point on these complex new supply chains, as you note, and the inevitability ultimately of electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's trying to do, in a way, and it's hard to discern with EVs because he's been pretty hostile with EVs, and it's become a political lightning rod. But I think in general, what we've seen, like with the Inflation Reduction Act before he was in office, this was a Biden administration push. They made it so you can only get the tax credit with $7,500 tax credit available for many people who buy an electric. Well, you can only get that now if the batteries in the car are made in the U.S. I mean, they've set it up so we're trying to, if the federal government's going to subsidize some of this stuff, it's going to have to be in the spirit of creating jobs in the U.S., getting some of the supply chain over here. It's just right now, it's you have to go through China for so much of that it's hard to stand up those industries.
Yeah, you wrote an interesting, or your newspaper, you co-authored an interesting piece from January of this year on EV battery belt towns, which are betting Trump won't ditch them. Of course, these battery belt towns were set up or invested by Biden. Is Trump aware of these battery belt towns, or is he so interested in politics and not willing to acknowledge that he has any kind of moral or economic obligation towards these towns, these battery manufacturers?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question when everyone's looking at what's going to happen with federal support for EVs under Trump. And, I think there's a lot of doomsday scenarios. I don't really see it. It's going to be a headwind, I think, for sure. But the battery piece of this, there's this ton of money available to companies that make batteries in the US. And more than a dozen of these giant plants have sprung up across the South and Midwest. So Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, all the way through Ohio, Indiana. Like, these are all red states, right? Republican controlled states who aren't, I don't think, going to look too kindly if the Trump administration or Congress wants to claw back something like $150 billion worth of credits that would they'll go to places like GM and Ford and Toyota and Rivian, but they're supporting jobs in those states. And these companies are losing billions of dollars right now in their EVs. I think the idea is help them stand up a profitable industry so we can compete globally and create jobs in the US. It'll be interesting to see. He's been pretty quiet on this point on the battery belt thing. He's saying $7,500. I want to see it go away. It's more of a Congress's decision on that. But the battery stuff, it's going to be hard to claw back, I think.
You've noted the personal politics here. Musk obviously appears in this. Seems to be a cleavage within the MAGA movement between hardcore working class populists like Steve Bannon and globalizers like Musk. Might this be one area where they're actually on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, Musk's position on this has been really interesting. He's the CEO of the largest EV maker in the world, right? So you would think that he would support federal subsidies for EVs. He does not, even though his company over the years has certainly been helped by the federal government, loans early on. And, this credit regime where companies that their cars aren't as green as others, they have to pay a tax basically to Tesla. They have to buy credits from Tesla. That's been a source of billions of dollars over the years. But now what Elon Musk says is he doesn't think there should be any government help on this stuff. And I think in the short to medium term, that's going to hurt Tesla. But I believe it's a calculated bet that it's going to hurt his rivals more. And then, I think Musk more and more views Tesla as more of a tech company that's going to solve self-driving cars and, AI and robotics. And, he even said the other day, like, EVs, like, he used the word inevitable. He said, this is, you're going to have to start with electric. Those are table stakes. And then from there, the race is on the tech, the self-driving technology. That's where he's steering Tesla. So, I think
Well, I'm not sure if he's steering it, Mike.
Well, yeah, that's true.
And they're launching. I want to get on at the end of this conversation to self-driving cars. Teslas have announced that they're launching a self-driving car service in Texas in June of this year. What about the other politics? Chrysler Freeland, who is rumored to be the next Prime Minister of Canada, has been very aggressive in suggesting that Canada should essentially punish Musk's Teslas. Can you see a lot of these new trade wars being built around Tesla and Musk's personality?
Yeah, I don't know if, we'll have to see how the Musk-Trump relationship plays out. I mean, right now, he seems to be very much a point person in the administration. He's, I think he's been in lockstep with a lot of these big questions on tariffs and trade and EV policy. I think there's no question we're going to see retaliate. I mean, a lot of the auto suppliers that I've been talking to are already expecting retaliatory moves from Mexico and Canada. That's just going to further complicate what's already a really thorny problem for these guys and the costs that are being inflated in the system. So I don't know if it's as much. Sure, I suppose Tesla could be in the crosshairs when other countries are looking to sort of set policy and could target them. But I think they have bigger fish to fry, maybe in terms of how are we going to respond broadly to the U.S., which just kind of ignored a trade pact we've had for over 3 decades and slapped 25% tariffs overnight. It's going to be it's going to be interesting to see what happens in terms of retaliatory moves by either of those countries and others.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, as I said at the beginning, whether this is really boxing or wrestling. One astonishing thing, Mike, is that we've talked about Europe, we've talked about the United States, we've talked about China, you mentioned Korea. We haven't talked at all about the Japanese car industry. In the 80s, of course, Japan was supposed to be the dominant new player in global economics. As you noted earlier, Toyota invented the hybrid with its Prius. How have the Japanese missed out so dramatically on this? They must be deeply regretful, aren't they? Especially given that the initiatives now are coming from China, their great rival in East Asia.
I think they probably would have a mixed answer to that. I think if you were sitting here with Toyota's CEO today, they would say, look, we got this right. We knew that this wasn't going to go as fast as everyone else thought it would in places like the US and Europe. And so we didn't bet as big early on EVs. And I think a lot of that was because of their strength in hybrid, right? I mean, they were protecting their big profit center. That in these markets of the Europe and the US, that looks pretty pragmatic and smart right now. But I do think that they face these same long-term risks of China getting too far ahead on EVs and battery technology. And it's not like they can, stand there smugly and say, we told you so, because US demand might be lower than people expected right now. I think they know that they're going to have to change over time and really compete with companies like Tesla and NIO and XPeng and BYD.
Yeah, it's funny. Back in the 80s, people were using your I word, inevitable, to describe the Japanese car industry. So it should be perhaps a reminder, a warning that we have to be careful with this word. Although one thing that, again, seems inevitable, we touched on this earlier, and maybe it's an appropriate ending, is the role of AI and of self-driving cars. Waymo, which is owned by Alphabet, the Google company, dominates now San Francisco streets. It's hard to go out now in San Francisco without seeing a Waymo. How, and I use this word carefully, Mike, how inevitable, in your view, are self-driving cars? We noted earlier that Tesla is launching its own self-driving car service in Texas later this year. Apparently, there are going to be 15 million new Chinese EVs to have self-driving features this year. So it seems pretty inevitable, isn't it?
I would feel less comfortable putting the word on a book about autonomous cars right now than electric cars, I think. We've seen a lot of head fakes on this technology before. It certainly has advanced. AI is going to help. There's actual robo-taxi services, ride hailing services that Waymo's now offering in several cities. As you said, Tesla thinks it's going to get there this year. So we're seeing actual commercialization of the technology, which we hadn't, that was supposed to have happened many years ago, according to the industry. It never did. I worry that the whole this whole market is kind of one bad incident away from a backlash by either regulators or consumers. I don't know that people are ready to have robot cars running over people. I mean, we want other humans to run over us. I think I think the idea that a robot car, if and when there's an incident, and they've gotten much safer, and I think we're at the point where they're going to start to claim that these are safer than the average car, the average driver, even the best of drivers. I could see us getting to that point. The regulatory framework hasn't sort of kept pace, and it's a bit of a wild west right now. And I do worry that there could be an incident that happens that sets it all back, because we've seen that in the past.
Finally, we haven't even talked about this. There's so much to discuss. The Washington Post had an interesting piece on, maybe doesn't use the word inevitable, but it suggests that your robot chauffeur is on its way. We should welcome it. Certainly, it will bring down traffic accidents. Some people might miss driving. But what about the broader issue, Mike, of the environment? Of course, many people still associate EVs with addressing climate change. How, if it is indeed inevitable in the long term, in the next 30, 40, 50 years, that everyone driving in the world will be driving electric vehicles, what kind of impact will this have on the environment?
Well, it's a misnomer that these are zero emission vehicles, right? I mean, there's more carbon emissions that go into the manufacturing of an EV than a regular gas car, because of the minerals you have to extract from the earth. And there's a bunch of electricity it needs, and water consumption in the battery process. So when an EV rolls off the assembly line, you're already, you're behind. That was more, that was worse on the earth than the gas engine car that's rolling off the assembly line. Of course, over time, as you drive with electric power instead of fossil fuels, that works itself out to the point where at the end of the life cycle, it's been 30% less emissions from the EV than the gas powered car. So it's not perfect by any means. A lot of it depends on where you live and where, what, if it's fossil fuels that generate your electricity. And for most Americans, that's the case. But by and large, it's better for the environment than gas powered cars. And one thing on the autonomous, I think is important to point out, which is another reason why I think it's inevitable from the car industry standpoint, is these EVs are the best tool to move in the direction they want to move on autonomous cars and more digital cars and updatable cars. You can do that stuff with gas and diesel vehicles, but it's harder to do. It's a lot easier to do with electrics. And so that's why you're going to see this move play out more on the supply side, where the car makers are making more EVs than internal combustion.
Yeah, and of course, the big boom these days is in AI. It's interesting that Silicon Valley's missed out on this. There used to be lots of talk about an Apple car. I think Apple have given up on it. So this is another revolution. Maybe the margins or the scale isn't there for big Silicon Valley companies. I mean, Google owns Waymo, but Apple and Amazon and Facebook, the major players in Silicon Valley, are not really participants in this market, are they?
They're in the car. All of the big guys have software and digital features in the car. NVIDIA's got chips in the car. Google and Apple have their interfaces where you can kind of like reflect what your phone looks like onto your screen. I mean, all that stuff. The tech companies are very much ensconced in the auto industry, but no, none of them have had the appetite to go build a car like we saw with the Chinese smartphone brand Xiaomi. Came out with a car last year, and now it's been a huge hit. They're selling tens of thousands of them. They kind of did almost overnight what Apple had talked about doing for a decade and never did. So yeah, not the stomach to get into the car business itself, but certainly part of the electronic, part of the car they're in.
Well, Mike Colias, the author of Inevitable, inside the messy, unstoppable transition to electric vehicles. You're a confident man, Mike, to use the word inevitable, but perhaps you're right. The book is out this week. Congratulations. And this is a story that will continue to run. It's going to have huge ramifications for how we live in the 21st century. So we'll get you back on the show to talk more about the inevitability of electric vehicles. Mike Colias, thank you so much.
Yeah, would love to come back on. It's been a joy talking to you. It was really fun.